Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a room beneath the mountains of terror, buried so deep beneath the earth that sunlight has not touched its walls in 10,000 years. It is a chamber so vast that entire armies could march through its corridors and never see the far wall. A place where the air itself tastes of ozone and old lightning, where the hum of machinery is so constant and so deep that it becomes indistinguishable from silence. And at the center of this chamber, atop a mountain of golden machinery that stretches nearly half a mile into the shadowed heights above, there sits a figure. He does not move. He has not moved in over 10 millennia. His body is a ruin. What was once the most magnificent physical form ever shaped by human genetics is now a withered husk, a desiccated remnant held together by technology so ancient that no living being fully understands how it works. His flesh has long since begun to decay, held in a state somewhere between life and death by stasis fields and psi-fusion generators that burn through the life force of 1,000 psychically gifted humans every single day. His eyes, which once blazed with the light of a mind that had watched civilizations rise and fall for 30,000 years, are dark and sunken. His hands, which once wielded a flaming sword that could cut through the fabric of reality itself, are skeletal claws fused to the arms of a throne that has become both his salvation and his prison. This is the Emperor of mankind, the master of humanity, the most powerful psychic being ever born of the human species. And for 10,000 years, the question that has haunted every corner of the galaxy he once sought to unite has been deceptively simple. What happens when he wakes up? Not if. When? Because the signs are there, scattered across the lore like breadcrumbs, left by a mind too vast for mortal comprehension. The miracles that have grown more frequent and more powerful in recent centuries. The golden light that has begun to manifest in the darkest corners of the Imperium. The saints who rise with power that burns like a star gone supernova. The conversation that took place between a father and his last loyal son. A conversation so intense that neither participant can fully remember what was said. The disease crafted in the cauldron of a god of plague, designed to kill one of the emperor's own sons. Ours that was undone by a power so immense that even the dark gods of chaos took notice and felt something they had not experienced in millennia. Fear. So settle in, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you like, put on something warm, and let the quiet darkness outside your window become a canvas for the imagination. Because we are going to explore one of the deepest and most fascinating questions in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. We are going to walk through the history of the Emperor, understand what he was before the Golden Throne claimed him, examine what the throne actually does and why it matters, look at every piece of evidence suggesting he is stirring from his long silence, explore the theories about what form his return might take, confront the terrifying implications of the Terminus Decree, and ultimately paint a picture of what the galaxy might look like on the day when the master of mankind opens his eyes and speaks with a voice that has been silent for 100 centuries. This is the story of the Emperor's awakening, and like everything in the grim darkness of the far future, it is a story where hope and horror walk hand in hand. Before we dive into the depths of this lore, think about that throne room for just a moment longer. Imagine the silence, not the absence of sound, because the machinery never stops. The generators never cease their humming, the life support systems never pause in their mechanical breathing, but a silence of voice, of will, of agency. For 10,000 years, the most brilliant mind ever born of the human species has been unable to speak a single word aloud, has been unable to lift a finger, turn his head, close his eyes, has been unable to do anything except think and fight and suffer in a prison of golden metal that the entire galaxy calls his throne. Every day, 1,000 psychers are brought before the apparatus of the Astronomicon and slowly, methodically, drained of their life force. Their screams, the lore tells us, are silenced by drugs and psychic conditioning, but the process is no less horrifying for its quiet efficiency. These men and women, some of them barely more than children, are the fuel that keeps humanity's guiding light burning. They give everything they are so that ships can find their way through the warp, so that the Imperium can function, so that the species can survive for one more day. And somewhere above them, entombed in technology that predates the Imperium itself, at the being who was once the brightest hope of humanity endures. Not because he chooses to, though choice may play a role. Not because the machines keep him alive, though they do, but because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. His death would be a catastrophe so complete that it would make every war, every plague, every disaster in human history look trivial by comparison. So he endures, and the galaxy turns. And the question burns in the minds of everyone who knows enough to ask it. What happens when he finally wakes up? Let us begin where all things begin, in the story of the Imperium. Let us begin with the man himself, before the throne, before the crusade, before the golden armor and the flaming sword, and the title that would make him the most worshipped being in the history of the human species. Thus, the origins of the emperor are shrouded in myth and deliberate obfuscation. The lore presents us with several competing narratives, and it is entirely possible that none of them are completely true, and all of them contain fragments of the real story. Different sources frame the emperor's history through propaganda, religion, and myth, and the Warhammer 40,000 setting deliberately maintains this ambiguity as a core design principle. What follows is the most widely cited account, assembled from multiple sources and stitched together into something approaching a coherent narrative. But the most widely accepted account goes something like this. Somewhere around the year 8000 BCE, in the ancient region of Anatolia, in what we would recognize as modern-day Turkey, the most powerful psychic event in human history took place. While a gathering of shamans, the most potent psychic minds of their era, came together in a ritual of unprecedented scope and sacrifice. These were not the shamans of popular imagination, not simple medicine men or tribal mystics. These were human beings who could perceive the currents of the warp, the dimension of pure psychic energy that exists alongside our material universe, and they understood that something terrible was growing in its depths. The emotions and psychic resonance of every sentient being in the galaxy were feeding entities of unimaginable power in the warp, beings that would eventually become the Chaos Gods. And these shamans knew that if left unchecked, these entities would consume humanity from within. So they made a choice. Every single one of them, thousands of the most gifted psychic minds on the planet, chose to die. Yet they ended their lives simultaneously, and as their souls entered the warp, instead of dispersing into its endless currents as souls normally do, they converged, they merged, they fused into a single point of psychic radiance so intense that it burned like a new star in the depths of the immaterial realm. And from that convergence, a child was born. A single human infant, carrying within his genetic structure and his psychic potential the combined power of every shaman who had given their life to create him. The new man, the first and last of his kind, the being who would spend the next 30,000 years walking among humanity as a ghost, a shadow, a quiet figure who appeared at turning points in history, who guided and nudged and sometimes fought alongside the species he had been created to protect. He was, and according to some accounts, Alexander the Great. He was a philosopher in ancient Rome. He walked the courts of medieval kings and the battlefields of world wars. He watched humanity reach for the stars during the dark age of technology, when human civilization spanned the galaxy and created wonders that would make the Adeptus Mechanicus weep with envy. And he watched it all come crashing down during the Age of Strife, when warp storms cut off world from world and humanity tore itself apart in an orgy of violence, mutation, and despair. It was during this darkest of hours that the Emperor finally stepped out of the shadows. No longer content to guide from behind the scenes, he revealed himself to the fragmented warlords and techno-barbarian kings who fought over the irradiated ruins of Terra, what we would call Earth. And with an army of genetically enhanced warriors called the Thunder Warriors, he conquered. Nation by nation, kingdom by kingdom, he brought the cradle of humanity under a single banner for the first time since the collapse of civilization. But unification of Terra was never the goal. It was merely the first step. The Emperor had a vision, a dream that consumed every fiber of his being and drove every decision he would make for the centuries to come. He would unite humanity across the entire galaxy. He would create a civilization so strong, so enlightened, so fundamentally resilient that the predatory entities of the warp could never again threaten human survival. He would free his species from the need to travel through the dangerous currents of the warp by building a gateway into the webway, the ancient network of tunnels through a dimension between dimensions that the Aeldari, the elder alien race, had used for millennia. And he would guide humanity through its next great evolutionary leap, the transition into a fully psychic species, safely and without falling prey to the dark whispers of chaos. It was a beautiful dream, perhaps the most beautiful dream any mind has ever conceived. And like all beautiful dreams, it was destined to become a nightmare. But before the nightmare, there was glory. The early days of the Imperium, the period that historians would later call the Great Crusade, represented the apex of human civilization in the galaxy. The Emperor, clad in golden armor that burned with the light of a captured star, led his armies from world to world, liberating human populations that had been isolated for millennia during the Age of Strife. Some of these populations had regressed to pre-industrial levels of technology, their ancestors' achievements forgotten or misremembered as mythology. Others had survived by making terrible compromises, entering into pacts with alien races or, worse, with the entities of the warp. A few had thrived, building small empires of their own in the darkness between the stars. The Emperor offered all of them the same thing: unity under the banner of the Imperium, the protection of his armies, and access to the technological marvels that humanity had once produced during the dark age of technology. Those who accepted joined willingly. Those who refused were given the choice to comply or face the consequences. And those consequences were delivered by the Space Marines, the transhuman warriors who were, in many ways, the Emperor's most magnificent and most dangerous creation. The Space Marines were not merely soldiers. They were living weapons, each one the result of a process so extreme and so invasive that it can barely be called surgery. Ordinary young men, selected for their genetic compatibility and mental resilience, were subjected to years of painful modification, receiving additional organs, enhanced bone structure, synthetic muscle fibers, and a suite of biological upgrades that transformed them from baseline humans into something that could survive conditions that would kill an unmodified person in seconds. They were faster, stronger, tougher, and more resilient than any natural organism. They could eat rocks and extract nutrition from them. They could survive in the vacuum of space. They could enter a meditative state so profound that their bodies could repair damage that would be fatal to anyone else. And there were hundreds of thousands of them, organized into 20 great legions, each one led by one of the Emperor's genetically crafted sons. To accomplish his vision, the Emperor created the Primarchs, 20 superhuman beings crafted from his own genetic template and imbued with fragments of his psychic power, each designed to embody a different aspect of the ideal warrior leader. They were to be his generals, his sons, the living instruments through which he would reshape the galaxy. But the Chaos Gods, sensing the threat that the Emperor's plan represented to their dominion over the warp, each struck before the Primarchs could mature. They reached into the Emperor's laboratory beneath the Himalayan mountains and scattered the infant Primarchs across the galaxy, sending each one to a different world where they would grow to adulthood far from their father's guidance. The Emperor was devastated by this loss, But he was not deterred. Using the genetic material he had developed for the Primarchs, he created the Space Marines, the Legiones Astartes, transhuman warriors who carried echoes of the Primarchs' abilities and were organized into 20 great legions, one for each lost son. And with these legions at his command, the Emperor launched the Great Crusade. For 2 centuries, the armies of the Imperium swept across the galaxy like a golden tide. World after world was brought into compliance, either through diplomacy or through the application of overwhelming military force. The Emperor found his scattered Primarchs one by one, reuniting with each son and placing them in command of their respective legions. It was the greatest military campaign in human history, a period of expansion and conquest that saw the Imperium grow from a single world to 1 million planets united under the Emperor's rule. And during all of this, the Emperor was simultaneously working on his greatest and most secret project. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in a laboratory so classified that even the Primarchs were not told of its existence, the Emperor was modifying an ancient device he had discovered buried in the deserts of Asia. A device from the dark age of technology, or perhaps even older, and a construction of golden metal and psychic circuitry that bore an uncanny resemblance to technology used by the ancient Eldari. This device, once restored, would serve as humanity's gateway into the webway, a permanent portal through which the entire species could travel between the stars without ever needing to enter the dangerous currents of the warp. This device was the Golden Throne. The Emperor intended to complete his webway project, connect humanity to the ancient network of safe passages through the dimension between dimensions, and then retire from active military command. One of his Primarchs, Magnus the Red, whose psychic abilities were second only to the Emperor's own, was to take his father's place on the throne, maintaining the psychic barrier that protected the human-built sections of the webway from demonic intrusion. The Emperor would then be free to guide humanity through the next stage of its evolution, teaching his species to harness their emerging psychic abilities safely and responsibly. It was a plan of staggering ambition and meticulous design, and it was destroyed by the very sons the Emperor had created to make it possible. The Horus Heresy. Those 2 words carry more weight in the Warhammer 40,000 universe than perhaps any others. They describe the single most catastrophic event in human history, a galaxy-spanning civil war that saw half of the Emperor's Primarchs betray their father and everything he had built, that brought the Imperium to the very edge of annihilation, and that ultimately condemned the Emperor to an existence that makes death look like a kindly mercy. The story of the heresy is vast and complex, filling dozens of novels and hundreds of hours of lore discussion. But for our purposes, what matters are the events that led to the Emperor's imprisonment on the Golden Throne, because understanding how he ended up there is essential to understanding what it would mean for him to leave it. It began with Horus, the War Master, the Emperor's most favored son, the Primarch, who had been chosen above all others to lead the Great Crusade in the Emperor's absence while he worked on the Webway project. Horus was brilliant, charismatic, beloved by his brothers, and worshipped by his troops. He was also vulnerable, and the Chaos Gods exploited that vulnerability with a patience and cunning that spanned centuries. Through visions, whispered promises, and the manipulation of Horus's deepest fears and resentments, the dark powers of the warp gradually turned the War Master against his father. They showed him a future where the Emperor would become a god worshipped by all of humanity, while the Primarchs were forgotten, cast aside like tools that had outlived their usefulness. They offered him power beyond anything the material universe could provide, and in a moment of weakness, wounded and dying on a world called Davin, Horus accepted their bargain. The corruption spread like a plague. Horus carefully identified which of his brother Primarchs harbored their own grievances against the Emperor, their own doubts and resentments, and one by one, he brought them to his side. Lorgar, who had been publicly humiliated by the Emperor for worshipping him as a god. Angron, yet who had never forgiven the Emperor for taking him from his world. before he could die alongside his fellow gladiators. Magnus, who would inadvertently provide the catalyst for the entire tragedy. Mortarion, Perturabo, Fulgrim, Conrad Curza, Alfarius. 9 Primarchs in total turned traitor, taking their legions and their worlds with them. The first blow fell at Istvan III, where Horus purged his own legions of loyalist elements, butchering thousands of space marines who refused to turn against the Emperor. The second blow, even more devastating, came at Istvan V, where 3 legions that had been sent to punish Horus for his treachery turned their weapons on the loyalist forces instead, massacring them in what became known as the Drop Site Massacre. In a single day, 3 entire legions of loyal space marines were effectively destroyed, their survivors scattered and broken. But it was the actions of Magnus the Red that would seal the Emperor's fate on the Golden Throne. Magnus, despite his loyalty to his father, had been forbidden from practicing the sorcerous arts that came so naturally to him and his Thousand Sons Legion. When he learned of Horus's betrayal through his psychic abilities, Magnus desperately tried to warn the Emperor by projecting a psychic message across the galaxy, piercing the barriers of the warp to reach Terra. In doing so, he shattered the psychic wards protecting the Emperor's Webway project. The scale of this disaster cannot be overstated. The Emperor had spent years, perhaps decades, carefully constructing the human-built sections of the Webway, layering psychic protection over every corridor and junction, creating a safe pathway through a dimension that was, by its very nature, exposed to the predatory energies of the warp. The original Webway had been built by the ancient Eldari, using a psychically resistant material that humanity could not replicate. The human-built sections were therefore dependent entirely on the Emperor's psychic shielding for their protection. When Magnus's message tore through those shields, it was like punching a hole in the hull of a submarine at the bottom of the ocean. The warp came rushing in, not gently, not gradually, but with the howling fury of a dimension that had been pressing against the barriers for years, waiting for exactly this kind of breach. Demons of every description, creatures of malice and hunger and impossible geometry, they poured into the human-built sections of the Webway and fell upon the workers and soldiers stationed there. The Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence, the Emperor's own personal warriors, fought a desperate holding action in the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace. The war within the Webway, as it came to be known, was a nightmare of close-quarters combat against enemies that did not obey the laws of physics and could not truly be killed, only dispersed temporarily before they reformed and attacked again. Thousands of custodians and Mechanicus workers died in those tunnels, fighting an enemy that was, quite literally, infinite. For every demon destroyed, 10 more emerged from the roiling madness of the warp to take its place. The Emperor himself was forced to intervene. Yet he ordered the Sisters of Silence to gather 1,000 psychers from across the galaxy and sacrifice them to the Golden Throne, providing enough power for the device to function for a single day without his personal attention. He used that day to plunge into the Webway himself, sweeping aside the demonic hordes with a display of psychic power that terrified even the entities of the warp. He confronted the daemon Drakenyen, a being born from the first murder in human history, and sealed it into the body of his loyal custodian, Ra Endymion, ordering Ra to flee deep into the Webway and carry the daemon as far from humanity as possible. But even the Emperor's intervention was not enough to save the project. The damage was too extensive, the breach too wide, the warp too insistent. Eventually, the Imperial forces had to abandon the Webway entirely, retreating back into the Imperial Palace and sealing the portal behind them. But only the Emperor's psychic power was strong enough to keep the seal in place. The moment he stopped concentrating, the barrier would fail, and Terra would be invaded by a demonic host of unimaginable proportions. The barrier that kept the daemons of the warp from flooding into the human-built sections of the Webway collapsed. Howling entities of pure malice poured through the breach, slaughtering thousands of workers and threatening to burst through the portal beneath the Imperial Palace and engulf Terra itself. The Emperor was forced to abandon his work, and take his place on the Golden Throne. Using his own psychic might to hold the breach closed, he was trapped. The most powerful being in the galaxy, Helm, the architect of humanity's greatest hope, was now chained to a device that demanded his constant attention and his full psychic concentration. He could not leave the throne without opening a doorway for chaos to invade the very heart of the Imperium. The Webway project, his life's work, lay in ruins. And across the galaxy, his favorite son was marching toward Terra with half the Imperium's military might at his back. The siege of Terra that followed was the bloodiest battle in human history. Horus's forces surrounded the Imperial Palace, bombarding it with weapons that could crack continents and unleashing horrors from the warp that turned brave soldiers into gibbering wrecks. The Loyalist defenders, led by the Primarchs Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, and Yaghatai Khan, fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that this was humanity's last stand. And on the Golden Throne, the Emperor endured. He held the warp breach closed while his sons bled and died in the corridors of his palace. He directed the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided Imperial ships through the warp, ensuring that Rabuta Guilliman's relief fleet could find its way to Terra. And he waited, knowing that eventually he would have to face Horus himself. Before the siege began, the Emperor had taken one critical precaution. His son Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders and the greatest craftsman among the Primarchs, had been guided to construct a device of terrible purpose. The Talisman of 7 Hammers, installed into the Golden Throne itself, was a dead man's switch of apocalyptic proportions. If the throne failed, if the Emperor died, the talisman would activate, consuming all of Terra in a conflagration so intense that it would give demons themselves a true death. It was the ultimate scorched earth strategy, a guarantee that even if Horus won, the prize he sought would be reduced to atoms before he could claim it. When the moment finally came, when Horus lowered the shields of his flagship, the vengeful spirit, in a deliberate taunt, the Emperor knew he had to act. He entrusted the Golden Throne to Malcador the Sigillite, his oldest friend and the second most powerful human psyker, knowing full well that the effort would kill the man who had stood beside him for longer than anyone could remember. The Emperor, accompanied by Rogal Dawn, Constantine Valdor of the Custodes and a contingent of his most elite warriors, teleported aboard the vengeful spirit. There, he found the body of Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch of the Blood Angels, who had confronted Horus first and been slain by his corrupted brother. And there, in the heart of a ship that had become a temple to the dark gods, the Emperor faced his son for the final time. The vengeful spirit was no longer truly a ship by this point. The concentrated warp energy that Horus had channeled into it had transformed the vessel into something between a starship and a demonic realm, its corridors twisted into impossible geometries, its bulkheads weeping blood, its very atmosphere thick with the presence of all 4 chaos gods working in concert. Sanguinius had already fallen here. The angel, the most beautiful and beloved of all the Primarchs, he had confronted Horus before the Emperor arrived and had been destroyed. The sight of his favored son's broken body, wings torn and armor shattered, lying at the feet of the monster that Horus had become, may have been the moment that finally pushed the Emperor past his last hesitation. The battle between father and son was not a simple physical confrontation, though physical violence certainly played a part. It was a war fought simultaneously in the material universe and in the warp, a clash of psychic wills so intense that it sent shockwaves through the immaterial realm that were felt by psychers across the galaxy. What happened during that confrontation has been told in many ways, and the most recent accounts from the Siege of Terra novel series paint a picture that is far more complex and terrifying than earlier versions suggested. Like the Emperor, empowered by the faith and sacrifice of millions, was on the verge of ascending to something beyond human, a being of pure warp energy that could have challenged the Chaos Gods themselves. The cumulative worship of the Imperium, the prayers of the faithful, the dying thoughts of soldiers who breathed his name with their last breath. All of it was flowing into him, transforming him, elevating him to a level of power that even the dark gods found alarming. He was becoming, for lack of a better term, a god. The Dark King, as some accounts name this potential entity, a being of such terrible power that it would have upset the entire balance of the warp, and he chose not to. Through the intervention of Millennium's person, a fellow perpetual who had followed the Emperor across millennia, the master of mankind was reminded of what he was fighting for. Not power, not dominion, humanity, the flawed, fragile, beautiful species that he had been created to protect. In a moment of terrible clarity, the Emperor cast away the godlike power that was coalescing around him, a fragment of his soul that contained, according to the law, almost all of his hope, his loyalty, and his compassion. He let it drift into the warp like a spark cast from a bonfire, where it would slowly begin to grow, fed by the faith and belief of billions. Then, diminished but still formidable, he destroyed Horus. The cost was catastrophic. The Emperor's body was shattered, his limbs destroyed, his organs ruptured, his physical form broken beyond any possibility of natural healing. Rogal Dorn carried his father's broken body back to the Imperial Palace, where Malkador, burned to a husk by the effort of maintaining the Golden Throne, used his last flicker of life to keep the Emperor conscious long enough to give his final instructions. Place him on the Golden Throne, modify it to sustain his life, let the Psyker sacrifice his power the Astronomicon, maintain the barrier against the warp breach, keep the Imperium alive. Malkador the hero died as the Emperor was installed upon the throne, and the master of mankind has sat there ever since, his mind active in the warp even as his body slowly rots around the cybernetic mechanisms that keep his vital functions barely operational, neither truly alive nor permitted to die, for 10,000 years. So what does the Golden Throne actually do? This is a question that seems simple on the surface but becomes extraordinarily complex the deeper you dig into the lore. Because the throne is not just a life support machine. It is not just a psychic amplifier. It is not just a webway gate controller. It is all of these things simultaneously, and possibly several other things that no one in the current Imperium fully understands. Let us break it down into its known functions. First, and most obviously, the Golden Throne keeps the Emperor alive. His body, ravaged beyond anything that even the most advanced medical technology could repair, is suspended in a network of stasis fields and psi-fusion generators that maintain his cellular structure in a state of near-perfect preservation. Without the throne, yet his body would complete its decay and his physical anchor to the material universe would be lost. The technology that accomplishes this dates back to the Dark Age of technology, a period so far in humanity's past that the knowledge of how it works has been almost entirely lost. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the technology-worshipping organization responsible for maintaining the throne, performs its duties through ritual and rote memorization of procedures that are thousands of years old, without truly understanding the principles behind them. Second, the Golden Throne powers and directs the Astronomicon. This is the psychic beacon that makes faster-than-light travel possible for the Imperium. Without the Astronomicon, the mutant navigators who guide Imperial ships through the warp would have no fixed reference point. In no lighthouse in the psychic storm, ships would be lost, fleets would scatter, entire sectors would be cut off from one another. The Imperium, which depends on interstellar trade and communication for its very survival, would fragment and collapse within years. The Astronomicon is powered by the life forces of 10,000 specially trained psychers drawn from the ranks of the Adeptus Astronomica. These chosen, as they are called, are taught the philosophy of their sacrifice and brought to an understanding of its necessity before they are called to serve in the chamber of the Astronomicon, where their psychic energies are slowly drained to fuel the beacon. Up to 1,000 of these psychers die every single day, their life forces consumed by the process.
Now, I want to take a quick second here to give you my honest take on all of this. because I think it matters. Out of everything we have covered so far, the thing that hits me the hardest is not the power levels, or the psychic battles, or the galaxy shaking implications. It is the loneliness. Think about it. This is a being who has been conscious, fully aware, trapped inside a rotting body for 10,000 years, with no one to talk to, no companionship, no rest, just endless duty and endless pain. And when his own son finally comes to visit him after all that time, he cannot even manage to say something kind. That breaks my heart a little, honestly, because it tells me that the Emperor is not just physically broken, he is emotionally shattered. Whatever he was before the throne, the man who walked among humanity for 30,000 years, who laughed and fought and built and dreamed, that person has been ground down by suffering into something that even his own children cannot recognize anymore. And I think this is the real tragedy of this whole story. Not the wars, not the politics, not even the chaos gods. Just a father who has forgotten how to love his son. But anyway, let's get back to the video.
The Emperor does not provide the energy for the beacon himself. What he does, and what only he can do, is direct that immense psychic energy across approximately 50,000 light-years of the galaxy, focusing it into a coherent beam that navigators can detect and use for orientation. Without the Emperor, all of that psychic energy would simply dissipate into the warp, useless and unfocused. No other being in the galaxy possesses the mental capacity to handle such immense power and direct it across such vast distances. Third, the Golden Throne maintains the seal over the shattered webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace. When Magnus the Red's psychic message tore through the Emperor's protective barriers, it opened a permanent breach between the material universe and the warp in one of the most densely populated locations in the galaxy. The Emperor's psychic might is the only thing holding this breach closed. If he were to stop concentrating on this task, even for a moment, demons would pour through the portal and flood Terra itself. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal bodyguard, have been fighting a continuous battle against the demonic forces that managed to seep through the weakened seal. This conflict, known as the Blood Games in some accounts and the War within the Webway in others, has been raging without pause for 10,000 years, one of the longest-running military engagements in human history, and most of the Imperium has no idea it is even happening. Imagine that for a moment. Somewhere beneath the most heavily fortified building in the galaxy, in tunnels and chambers that were supposed to be humanity's gateway to a brighter future, the Emperor's Golden Warriors have been fighting demons every single day for 100 centuries. Generation after generation of custodians have descended into the darkness beneath the throne, armed with the finest weapons humanity has ever produced, and fought creatures of living nightmare in close quarters, combat that would break the minds of lesser warriors. Some of them have been fighting for centuries, their superhuman constitutions keeping them alive long past the point where any ordinary soldier would have succumbed to exhaustion, injury, or madness. The demons they fight are not the disorganized rabble that most Imperial forces encounter. These are entities that have been pressing against the same barrier for 10 millennia, evolving their tactics, probing for weaknesses, adapting to the fighting styles of the Custodes, with the patient malevolence that only beings of the warp can muster. The Custodes, in turn, have developed fighting techniques and strategies that exist nowhere else in the Imperium, born from a war that no one else even knows about. It is a conflict fought in absolute secrecy, its casualties unrecorded, its heroes unsung, its very existence denied by every official source in the Imperium. And it all rests on the Emperor's shoulders. Every moment of his psychic attention that wavers, every fraction of his concentration that slips, the barrier weakens and more demons push through. The Custodes can hold back a trickle. They cannot hold back a flood. If the Emperor's grip on the seal ever truly fails, even for a moment, the consequences would be apocalyptic. Fourth, and this is where things become truly interesting, the Golden Throne may be doing something else entirely, something that even the Emperor's closest servants do not fully understand. In the final novel of the Horus Heresy series, Malcador delivers a soliloquy in which he reveals that the Golden Throne is actually slowly healing the Emperor. That the master of mankind is not simply being kept in stasis, not merely preserved in his broken state, but is gradually recovering, knitting himself back together through a process so slow and so subtle that it has taken 10 millennia and is still not complete. If this is true, and there are reasons to believe it is, then the Golden Throne is not just a prison or a life support system. It is a cocoon, a chrysalis within which the most powerful being in human history is slowly, agonizingly, transforming into something new. The question is, what is he transforming into? To understand the Emperor's current state and what his awakening might look like, we need to appreciate the sheer scale of suffering involved in keeping him alive. Because the Golden Throne is not a comfortable hospital bed where a patient rests and recovers. It is, by every account we have, an instrument of constant and unrelenting agony. The Emperor's existence is described as an unending torment. His every thought is enslaved to the tasks of maintaining the Astronomicon, holding the webway breach closed, and fighting the chaos gods in the psychic realm of the warp. He cannot rest. He cannot sleep. He cannot let his concentration waver for even a fraction of a second. Every moment of every day for 10,000 years, and has been an exercise in suffering so profound that it would drive any lesser being to madness within seconds. And the cost of maintaining this state has only grown worse over time. In the early millennia after the Emperor's interment, the Astronomicon could be powered by a relatively modest number of psychers. But by the late 36th millennium, the mechanisms of the Golden Throne began to require more and more psychic fuel to remain operational. The tech priests who serviced the throne demanded an increase in the number of psychers sacrificed daily. The black ships, the vessels of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica that travel the galaxy collecting psychers from imperial worlds, increased in both number and frequency. By the current era of the 42nd millennium, the throne requires 4 times the number of psychers that it did at the end of the 41st millennium. The hunger of the machine, or perhaps the hunger of the being within it, grows with each passing century. Some estimates suggest that across the entire history of the Emperor's internment, billions of psychers have been sacrificed to keep him alive, and the Astronomicon burning. It is, by any measure, the most sustained act of mass sacrifice in the history of any species in the galaxy. And even this may not be enough. In the final years of the 41st millennium, the Adeptus Mechanicus made a discovery so terrifying that it was immediately classified at the highest possible level. The mechanisms of the Golden Throne were failing, not in a gradual, manageable way, but in a manner that was beyond the ability of the Mechanicus to repair. The knowledge of how the throne's systems worked had been lost over the millennia, and the tech priests who maintained it were essentially performing rituals they did not understand on technology they could not comprehend. Critical components were degrading, and the Mechanicus had no idea how to replace them. This discovery triggered a series of desperate measures. The Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus, along with several members of the High Lords of Terror and elements of the Inquisition, hatched a plan of shocking audacity. They would reach out to the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, the torture-loving cousins of the Aeldari, who dwelt in the dark city of Komorragh within the Webway. Or the Drukhari possessed unparalleled knowledge of regenerative technology and were intimately familiar with the kind of ancient devices that the Golden Throne represented. In exchange for billions of human slaves and access to certain components of the throne itself, the Drukhari would provide technical solutions to the throne's malfunction. The bargain was struck, though not without complications. A homunculus, one of the Drukhari's twisted flesh sculptors, was smuggled onto Terra to examine the throne, but it escaped and went on a killing spree beneath the imperial palace before being hunted down and destroyed. The Drukhari, it turned out, had their own agenda. The components they received from the Golden Throne contained genetic material from the Emperor himself, which they planned to use to create their own psychic reactor. In the Dark Throne, to seal the demonic breaches that had been plaguing Komorragh since the birth of the Great Rift. According to Inquisitor Erasmus Crowell, who uncovered much of this conspiracy, the Mechanicus's bargain with the Drukhari has only delayed the destruction of the Golden Throne by a few centuries. The fundamental problem remains unsolved. The throne is dying, and when it dies, so does the Emperor. And when the Emperor dies, the consequences are almost too vast to contemplate. The Astronomicon would go dark. Imperial ships in the warp would be lost, unable to navigate without their guiding light. The webway breach beneath the Imperial Palace would tear open, flooding Terra with an unstoppable tide of demons. The Talisman of 7 Hammers, the dead man's switch that Vulcan installed during the siege of Terra, might activate, consuming the entire planet in purifying fire. And that is just what would happen on Terra. Across the galaxy, the loss of the Astronomicon would mean the end of interstellar travel, the end of communication between worlds, the end of the Imperium as a functioning civilization. 1,000,000 worlds, isolated and alone, would face the horrors of the galaxy without the protection of the Emperor's light. The Chaos Gods, no longer held in check by the Emperor's psychic will, would be free to pursue their dark designs without opposition. The great enemies of humanity, the green-skinned hordes, the endless swarms of the Tyranids, the ancient and implacable Necrons, would find an Imperium fractured and defenseless. This is the sword that hangs over the galaxy. This is the ticking clock that makes the question of the Emperor's awakening not merely academic, but existential. Because if the throne fails before the Emperor can rise from it under his own power, the result will be the end of human civilization in the galaxy. The sheer weight of what would be lost is staggering to contemplate. 1,000,000 worlds, ranging from hive cities that house billions of souls in towering spires of metal and concrete, to peaceful agricultural planets that have fed the Imperium for millennia. Ancient forge worlds, where the Adeptus Mechanicus guards the last remnants of humanity's technological heritage. Shrine worlds covered in cathedrals and monuments that represent 10,000 years of human artistic and spiritual achievement. Are fortress worlds bristling with defenses that have held back alien invasions and demonic incursions for centuries. Every one of these worlds depends on the Astronomicon for communication and trade. Every one of them depends on the Emperor's continued existence for their protection against the forces that would consume them. The human population of the Imperium numbers in the untold trillions. That is not a number that the human mind can easily comprehend. Trillions of men, women, and children living their lives across a galaxy-spanning empire, most of them completely unaware that everything they know and love depends on the continued functioning of a machine that is slowly falling apart, and the continued suffering of a being who has endured more pain than any consciousness in history. But the black ships bring their harvest of psychers to Terra in a never-ending procession, hundreds of vessels traveling the galaxy in a circuit that has been running for 10,000 years. These ships are among the most feared vessels in the Imperial fleet, because a visit from a black ship means that your world's psychers are being collected, not recruited, not invited, collected, taken from their families, often by force, loaded into the holds of vessels specifically designed to contain psychic powers, and transported to Terra, where most of them will be fed to the Golden Throne or the Astronomicon. For the families left behind, these are disappearances. Their children, their siblings, their parents are taken and never seen again. The Imperium tells them it is necessary. The Ecclesiarchy tells them it is holy. But the Inquisition tells them it is not to be questioned. But the grief is real, and it is multiplied across 1,000,000 worlds and 10,000 years until the total sum of human suffering generated by the Emperor's continued existence becomes something almost incomprehensible in its scale. And yet the alternative is worse. This is the terrible arithmetic of the Emperor's situation. The suffering caused by keeping him alive is immense, but the suffering that would be caused by letting him die would be immeasurably greater. Every psyker sacrificed to the throne is an individual tragedy. But every psyker sacrificed to the throne keeps the Astronomicon burning, which keeps the ships moving, which keeps the Imperium connected, which keeps billions of worlds fed and defended and alive. The math is horrifying, but it is also undeniable. And 1,000 deaths a day to prevent the death of trillions. This is the moral calculus that the Emperor understood when he gave his final instructions to Rogel Dawn. This is the weight that has pressed down upon the Golden Throne for 100 centuries. And this is the burden that will remain even if the Emperor wakes up, because the problems that put him on the throne in the first place, the webway breach, the need for the Astronomicon, the relentless hunger of chaos, these problems will not simply vanish because the master of mankind opens his eyes. But what if he wakes up before that happens? The evidence that the Emperor is stirring, that something is changing in the depths of the Sanctum Imperialis, has been accumulating for centuries. But it has accelerated dramatically in recent years, or to the point where even the servants of chaos have begun to take notice and feel genuine alarm. The first signs were subtle, miracles that had always been attributed to the Emperor's divine intervention became more frequent and more powerful. On the besieged world of benediction, a golden procession of spirits and light appeared on the walls of a fortress under attack by the forces of chaos, holding back the onrushing tide long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Reports of golden eagles manifesting in battle, of wounds healing without medical intervention, of prayers being answered with tangible, measurable results, began to filter in from across the Imperium. These phenomena were described by those who witnessed them as something new, and something qualitatively different from the miracles that had been recorded throughout imperial history. Previously, the Emperor's interventions, if they were interventions at all, and not simply the effects of random psychic phenomena or the overactive imaginations of desperate soldiers, had been subtle and ambiguous. A feeling of warmth during prayer, a sense of direction from the Emperor's tarot, small, personal moments that could be explained away as coincidence or faith. The new manifestations were anything but subtle. They were dramatic, visible, and increasingly powerful. Living saints, mortal women empowered by what appeared to be a direct connection to the Emperor's psychic might, rose with abilities that rivaled those of the most powerful psychers in the galaxy. Celestine, the living saint of the Adepta Sororitas, he died and was reborn multiple times, each resurrection accompanied by a blaze of golden light and a surge of psychic energy that sent demons fleeing. The nature of the living saints deserves particular attention here, because they represent something that the lore has struggled to categorize. In many ways, they function like imperial demons, mortal beings empowered by a warp entity, given abilities that transcend normal physics, sent to fight on behalf of the power that sustains them. The parallels to the champions of the Chaos Gods are uncomfortable and obvious, and Guilliman himself has noted the similarity with visible discomfort. If the Chaos Gods can empower mortal champions with fragments of their power, and the Emperor can do the same thing with his living saints, then the Emperor is functionally operating as a warp entity, regardless of whether he technically qualifies as a god by whatever arcane standards the universe uses to make that determination. The Legion of the Damned provides another piece of compelling evidence. These ghostly space marines, wreathed in spectral fire and bearing the marks of the Imperium upon their blackened armor, appear without warning on battlefields across the galaxy, always at the moment of greatest need, always fighting on the side of the Imperium, and always vanishing without a trace when the battle is won. Their nature is hotly debated. Some believe they are the lost battle brothers of the Firehawks chapter, transformed by a warp anomaly into something between space marines and demons. Others believe they are literally the spirits of fallen warriors, as summoned from wherever Imperial heroes go when they die to fight once more in the Emperor's name. Whatever they are, their appearances have become more frequent in recent centuries, and the golden fire that surrounds them burns with a light that is unmistakably similar to the light that emanates from the Golden Throne. during moments of particular psychic intensity. They are, at the very least, evidence that some power is actively intervening in the affairs of the galaxy on behalf of the Imperium. And the most obvious candidate for that power is the being sitting on the Golden Throne. During the Psychic Awakening, a galaxy-spanning event in which the psychic potential of humanity surged dramatically in the wake of the Great Rift's formation, the evidence became even more pronounced. Intercepted communications and astropathic transmissions garbled by the psychic turbulence of the era contained fragments that seemed to reference the Emperor directly. Reports flooded in from every segmentum of statues of the Emperor, weeping tears of blood, of shrines glowing with inner light, of prayers being answered with immediate and tangible results. On the world of benediction, an entire army of spectral golden warriors appeared on the walls of a besieged fortress, holding back a demonic incursion long enough for the mortal defenders to regroup and counterattack. The golden warriors fought with weapons of pure light, and their battle cries were described by those who heard them as the voice of the Emperor himself, speaking words of encouragement and defiance that reached directly into the hearts of the soldiers fighting below. These were not the ambiguous miracles of earlier centuries. These were interventions on a scale that suggested a consciousness actively choosing to act, a being reaching out across the vast distances of the galaxy to touch specific events at specific moments. And the timing was significant. Almost all of these manifestations occurred after the formation of the Great Rift, after the galaxy was torn in half by a wound in reality that stretched from the Eye of Terror to the eastern fringe. The Great Rift flooded the material universe with unprecedented levels of psychic energy, and it is possible, even likely, that this energy surge was the catalyst that began to wake the Emperor from his long torpor. Think of it this way. The Emperor had been maintaining the Astronomicon and holding the webway breach closed for 10,000 years, pouring every ounce of his psychic strength into these tasks. He was operating at maximum capacity with no reserves, no spare energy to devote to anything beyond survival. Then the Great Rift opened, and suddenly the warp was everywhere, flooding into reality through a crack that stretched across the entire galaxy. The psychic energy available to a being like the Emperor increased exponentially. And with that surplus of power, he began to do things he had not been able to do for millennia. He began to reach out, to touch the galaxy, to intervene. He began to wake up. But the most compelling evidence came from the events surrounding the return of Reboot Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, and the last loyal son of the Emperor to remain active in the galaxy. Guilliman had been in stasis for 10,000 years, or preserved in a state of near death after being struck down by the demon Primarch Fulgrim's poison blade at the Battle of Thessala. For 100 centuries, his body had rested in a stasis field on the world of Macraga, in a shrine that had become one of the most sacred pilgrimage sites in the Imperium. Millions of faithful had traveled across the galaxy to stand before the transparent casket that held the Primarch's frozen form, to pray for his recovery, to whisper their hopes and fears to a being who, by all rights, should have been dead. And then, against all probability, against everything that the Imperium's medical science said was possible, he was brought back. The Inari, a faction of the Eldari devoted to the worship of Iniad, the god of the dead, performed a ritual of such complexity and power that it bridged the gap between life and death itself. Ivrain, the herald of Iniad, channeled the death god's power into Guilliman's frozen body, burning away the poison that had been slowly killing him for 10 millennia and restoring his physiology to full function. But many observers noted something peculiar about the ritual. The power that flowed through Ivrain during the ceremony seemed to be drawn from more than just the Eldari deity. There was something else there, something that burned with a golden light that the Eldari recognized and feared. It was as if the Emperor himself was reaching through the warp, adding his own psychic might to the Eldari ritual, ensuring that his son would wake. If this interpretation is correct, It means the Emperor was already active enough, were already aware enough, to detect the Inari ritual happening on a world thousands of light years from Terra and to intervene in it. That level of awareness and agency goes far beyond what anyone had attributed to the Emperor for millennia. It suggests a being who is not merely surviving on the Golden Throne, but actively monitoring events across the galaxy and choosing to act when the opportunity presents itself. When Guilliman awoke, he launched the Terran Crusade, a desperate military campaign to reach Terra through a galaxy that was being torn apart by the opening of the Great Rift, the massive warp storm that split the Imperium in two. After surviving betrayal, imprisonment, and an assault by the demon Primarch Magnus the Red himself, Guilliman finally reached the Imperial Palace. And there, in the Sanctum Imperialis, standing before the Golden Throne for the first time in over 10,000 years, Roboute Guilliman met his father. The audience between Guilliman and the Emperor is one of the most significant events in the entire Warhammer 40,000 timeline, and it is deliberately shrouded in ambiguity and mystery. What we know comes from fragmentary accounts and the Primarch's own troubled reflections, and even these are contradictory and incomplete. Guilliman entered the throne room, accompanied by Captain General Trajan Valoris, the leader of the Adeptus Custodes. The chamber itself was almost beyond description, nearly 4 miles long and half a mile high, filled with churning machinery and alchemical fog, the air thick with psychic energy so intense that ordinary humans would die within seconds of exposure. The Emperor sat at the summit of a golden pyramid of ancient technology, his withered form barely visible through layers of stasis fields and protective barriers. And then, the Emperor awoke. For the first time in millennia, the mind that had been wholly consumed by the tasks of maintaining the Astronomicon and holding back the warp breach turned its attention to the physical world. The Emperor's consciousness reached out to his son, and what followed was a surreal experience that defied normal comprehension. According to Valoris, Guilliman appeared to stand in silent psychic conversation with the Emperor for several minutes. According to Guilliman's own memories, he fell to the ground in agony, overwhelmed by the sheer force of his father's psychic presence. Both accounts agree that only a few minutes seemed to pass for the two of them. But when they emerged from the throne room, over a day had elapsed in the outside world. What the Emperor said to Guilliman is the subject of intense debate and speculation within the lore. The Primarch himself can barely remember the specifics, his mind having been assaulted by what he describes as dark truths about the galaxy and its history. But the emotional impact was devastating and unmistakable. Guilliman felt that the Emperor had lost all pretense of humanity. The being on the Golden Throne did not greet his son with warmth or affection. There was no fatherly embrace, no expression of relief at seeing a long-lost child returned. Instead, the Emperor regarded Guilliman with the interest of a creator examining a long-lost tool, not as a father would look upon his son, but as a craftsman would assess a particularly useful instrument that had been misplaced. The Emperor's communications were fractured and contradictory, a consequence perhaps of a mind that had been shattered and reformed by 10 millennia of unimaginable suffering. He reportedly called Guilliman many things in the same exchange: his son, a tool, a betrayer, a failure, and the last hope of mankind. The words tumbled over one another, each one carrying a different emotional charge, as if the Emperor was speaking with multiple voices simultaneously, each one expressing a different facet of a consciousness that had become too vast and too fragmented for normal comprehension. One interpretation, suggested by later events in the novel Godblight, is that the Emperor's mind had become fractal in nature, a multiple personality existing on multiple levels of awareness simultaneously. He was at once the broken man on the throne, the intellect fighting in the warp, the nascent god being formed by the faith of trillions, and something else entirely, something that even the Aeldari, with their millennia of experience in dealing with warp entities, found difficult to categorize. What is certain is that Guilliman emerged from the throne room a changed being. The Primarch who had gone in seeking guidance from his father came out with a new determination and a deep, unspoken dread. He gathered the High Lords of Terra, and declared that the Imperium would be reorganized and rearmed under his leadership. He would serve as imperial regent, the voice of the emperor, bringing order to a galaxy that was falling apart at the seams. But privately, as the experience haunted him, Guilliman confided to those closest to him that he was not sure the being on the golden throne was still his father in any meaningful sense. The centuries of suffering had stripped away whatever warmth and humanity the emperor had once possessed, leaving something cold and alien in its place. The Primarch feared that the emperor had become something that could think but no longer feel, a consciousness so consumed by the demands of its impossible task that it had lost the capacity for the very emotions that made life worth preserving. It was a fear that would be put to the test during the events of the Plague War, when the emperor would intervene directly in the affairs of the galaxy in a way that he had not done for 10,000 years. And what he did during that intervention would change everything. As the events described in the novel Godblight represent perhaps the single most dramatic evidence of the Emperor's awakening and the most terrifying hint of what his return might look like. The setting was the garden world of Ajax, in the realm of Ultramar, the Primarch Guilliman's own domain. Mortarion, the demon Primarch of the Death Guard and a devoted servant of Nurgle, the chaos god of plague and decay, had invaded Ultramar with a massive force of corrupted space marines and demonic entities. His goal was to transform Ajax into a demon world, a permanent extension of Nurgle's garden into the material universe, and in doing so, drag the entire realm of Ultramar into the warp. The campaign was brutal and prolonged, stretching over months of grinding warfare across corrupted landscapes and desecrated shrines. But Mortarion had a secret weapon, a disease so potent that it had been crafted in the cauldron of Nurgle himself. The Godblight, as it was called, was a plague designed specifically to kill a Primarch, to not only end their physical existence, but to erase their very essence from the warp itself. It was the ultimate biological weapon, and Mortarion intended to use it on his brother Guilliman. The greater demon Kugath Plaguefather, one of Nurgle's most powerful servants, had collaborated with Mortarion in the creation of this disease. Kugath was motivated by his own desperate need for validation, haunted by the shame of his undignified creation as a great unclean one, forever seeking to prove himself through the creation of a plague so perfect, so devastating that even his patron god would be impressed. The Godblight was his masterwork, completed with a sample of Guilliman's own blood, gathered from an earlier battle on the world of Parmenio. The disease was so virulent that Kugath boasted it could not merely kill a son of the Emperor, but annihilate their very soul, burning their essence out of the warp like a candle flame in a hurricane. It was so contagious that upon exposure to air, it would destroy everything in its path, friend and foe alike, even Mortarion himself. The irony was not lost on anyone. The servants of Nurgle, the god of disease and entropy, had created a weapon that would destroy them as surely as their enemies. But Mortarion did not care. His hatred for Guilliman, for his father, for everything the Imperium represented, had consumed whatever remained of his reason. He wanted his brother dead, and he was willing to pay any price to achieve it. During the final confrontation between the two Primarchs on the ravaged surface of Ajax, Mortarion succeeded in administering the Godblight to Guilliman. The scene was one of horrifying intimacy, two brothers locked in combat among the ruins of a world that had once been a garden paradise, now reduced to a wasteland of blighted earth and diseased vegetation. Guilliman fought with the Emperor's own flaming sword, a weapon of immense psychic power, but Mortarion was empowered by the blessings of his patron god, and the demon Primarch's strength was augmented by the concentrated malice of the warp itself. The Primarch of the Ultramarines fell, his body racked by a disease that burned through even his superhuman physiology like acid through paper. He was dying, truly dying, yet in a way that even his incredible resilience could not overcome. The Godblight tore through his cells, unraveling his genetic structure, dissolving the bonds that held his enhanced body together. The greatest of the Emperor's remaining sons lay broken and failing on the corrupted soil of a dying world, and for a brief, terrible moment, it seemed as though Mortarion had won. And then something happened that sent shockwaves through the warp itself. The power of the Emperor manifested, not as a subtle influence, not as a vague feeling of warmth or a flickering miracle. The Emperor's power erupted into the material universe with a force that was felt across entire star systems. Guilliman, lying on the edge of death, experienced a direct and unmistakable communion with his father. The Emperor spoke to him, not in fragmented riddles or contradictory commands, but with clarity and purpose. He reached through the warp and touched his son's broken body, burning away the godblight with psychic fire so intense that it made Mortarion himself recoil in horror. Then the Emperor did something even more remarkable. He possessed Guilliman. The Primarch rose from the ground, his body suffused with golden light, his eyes burning with a power that was unmistakably not his own. Those who witnessed what happened next described it in terms of religious ecstasy and primal terror in equal measure. Guilliman, or rather the Emperor working through Guilliman, confronted Mortarion with a psychic might so overwhelming that the demon Primarch, a being who had been empowered by a chaos god, was unable to stand against it. A young girl on the world of Parmenio had earlier manifested the Emperor's powers directly, her body serving as an avatar for a consciousness so vast that even the custodian guard who witnessed it could only whisper a single word. "My lord." A demon fighting the Imperial forces called the girl Anathema, the title that the chaos gods themselves use for the Emperor, a word that means the ultimate enemy, the one thing in all of existence that they truly fear. The implications of these events are staggering. The Emperor was not merely influencing events from afar or providing subtle guidance through dreams and visions. He was directly intervening in the material universe, reaching across thousands of light years to heal mortal wounds, to speak with his sons, to possess the bodies of mortals and wield power through them against the enemies of humanity. This was not the behavior of a comatose patient being kept alive by machines. This was the behavior of a being who was awake, aware, and actively choosing to act. The greater demon Kugath, one of Nurgle's most powerful servants, discussed these developments with Mortarion in terms of barely concealed panic. They agreed that the evidence was mounting. The Emperor was gathering strength. Something was changing on the Golden Throne, and whatever was emerging from that 10,000-year cocoon of suffering and sacrifice was something that even the Chaos Gods found deeply unsettling. "A Primarch walks the stars for a century," Kugath observed, "and saints of the Anathema and his unliving legions are abroad. These are all signs that he of terror is gathering strength again." The enemies of mankind could see what was happening. The faithful could feel it in their prayers and their miracles. The question was no longer whether the Emperor was waking up. The question was what he would be when he finally opened his eyes. The theories about what the Emperor's return might look like fall into several broad categories, and each one carries implications that are both hopeful and terrifying. The first, and perhaps most widely discussed theory, is the concept of the Star Child. This piece of lore has been part of the Warhammer universe since its earliest days, first appearing in the Realm of Chaos books, published in the late 1980s. The basic premise is this. When the Emperor was mortally wounded during his battle with Horus, most of his soul dispersed from his body and merged into the warp, much as the souls of the ancient shamans had done so many millennia before. The Emperor, as a being created by the fusion of thousands of psychic souls, possessed the same ability to reincarnate that the shamans had demonstrated. His soul, or at least a core fragment of it, survived its dispersal into the warp and began to slowly coalesce into a new entity, a potential new soul awaiting rebirth. This entity was called the Star Child. The Star Child is essentially the seed of the Emperor's reincarnation. It exists in the warp as a nascent consciousness, growing slowly, fed by the faith and belief of humanity. If the Emperor's body were to finally die, freeing his soul from the Golden Throne, the Star Child might be born, while a new incarnation of the Emperor, with all of his power and knowledge, but free from the constraints of his ruined physical form. The connection to the recent law is striking. In The End and the Death, the final novel of the Horus Heresy series by Dan Abnett, the Emperor is described as casting away a fragment of his soul during his battle with Horus, a fragment that contained almost all of his hope, his loyalty, and his compassion. This fragment drifted into the warp like a spark from a bonfire, and Malkador, watching it go, described it in terms that echo the old Star Child lore perfectly. That this fragile spark would, as cosmic ages turned, slowly grow by a coalescence of emotion and belief, just as the powers of chaos grow. If the Star Child theory is correct, then the Emperor's awakening might not involve his ruined body rising from the Golden Throne at all. Instead, it might involve his death. His physical form would finally give out. His soul would be released from its prison, and it would merge with the Star Child, creating a new being of immense power, a genuine god of humanity forged from 10,000 years of faith and sacrifice. The implications of this scenario are both wonderful and horrifying. On one hand, a reborn emperor, free from the constraints of the Golden Throne, wielding the accumulated power of trillions of believers, would be a force unlike anything the galaxy has ever seen. He would be to the Chaos Gods what they have been to humanity, a predator, a hunter, a thing to be feared. The entity that the demons call the anathema would finally be unleashed at full strength. On the other hand, the death of the Emperor's physical body would mean the end of the Astronomicon, the collapse of the Webway seal, the activation of the Talisman of Seven Hammers, and the immediate and catastrophic collapse of the Imperium's ability to function as a coherent civilization. Billions would die in the chaos, pardon the expression, that followed, and there would be no guarantee that the reborn Emperor would be the same being that humanity had worshipped for 10 millennia. A god born from the warp is shaped by the beliefs and emotions that created it, and the Imperium's faith is not exactly characterized by gentleness and compassion. The God Emperor of the Imperial Creed is a being of wrath and judgment, a cosmic tyrant who demands absolute obedience and punishes heresy with extinction. And a god shaped by those beliefs might be a savior, or it might be something far more terrifying. The second major theory involves not rebirth, but recovery. This is the idea suggested by Malkador's revelation in The End and the Death, that the Golden Throne is slowly healing the Emperor, and that he is simply waiting for someone to wake him up. In this scenario, the Emperor's physical body would eventually be restored to functionality, and he would rise from the throne as he was, or at least as a version of himself capable of acting independently. The problems with this theory are obvious. The Emperor's body has been decaying for 10,000 years. Even with the most advanced medical technology in the galaxy, the prospect of healing a corpse that has been slowly rotting for 100 centuries seems optimistic at best. And even if his body could be healed, the question of what happens to the Webway breach and the Astronomicon remains unanswered. The Emperor cannot simply stand up and walk away from the throne without opening a doorway for chaos to invade Terra. Unless, of course, the breach has been slowly closing as well. Unless the Golden Throne's true function is not merely to hold the breach sealed, but to gradually repair the damage that Magnus caused 10,000 years ago, knitting the torn fabric of reality back together one molecule at a time. If that is the case, then perhaps there will come a day when the seal holds on its own and the Emperor is free to rise. The third theory is perhaps the darkest of all. It suggests that the Emperor is not healing and is not waiting to be reborn. Instead, he is evolving, becoming something fundamentally different from what he was. Something that is neither the man who sat upon the throne 10,000 years ago, nor a new god born from human faith, but a hybrid of both. A consciousness so vast and so alien that it would be recognizable to no one who had known the Emperor in his former life. This theory draws support from Guilliman's own observations during his audience with the Emperor. The Primarch described his father as having lost all pretense of humanity, as regarding his son with a coldness that was profoundly unsettling. If the Emperor is becoming something other than human, something that thinks in patterns and timescales that no mortal mind can comprehend, then his awakening might not be the salvation that the Imperium hopes for, and it might be the beginning of something entirely new and entirely unpredictable. There is also a fourth possibility that the Aeldari seem to believe is the most likely. In conversations between Gilliman, members of his psychic council, and an Aeldari farseer, the concept of the Emperor as a gestating god has been discussed with remarkable frankness. The farseer described the Emperor's situation in terms of faith being the most powerful force in the galaxy, a force that requires no proof to convince and grants conviction to those who believe. A single mind connected strongly to the warp can bend the laws of the universe, but a billion minds, all believing the same thing with absolute conviction, can reshape reality itself. If the Aeldari are right, then the trillions of humans who pray to the Emperor every day, who light candles in his name and whisper his litanies before battle, who die with his name on their lips and believe with every fiber of their being that he is a god, are not merely expressing their faith. They are creating something. They are feeding power into the warp, power that is coalescing around the fragment of the Emperor's soul that he cast away during his battle with Horus, slowly building it into something that will eventually achieve a critical mass and become self-sustaining. A fifth, chaos god, but one aligned not with rage or decay or scheming or excess, but with humanity itself, with order, with civilization, with the dream that the Emperor had for his species before everything went wrong. The idea is not as far-fetched as it might initially sound. The Chaos Gods were not always the immense, all-powerful entities they are today. They were born from the collective psychic emissions of sentient beings, growing from tiny sparks of emotion in the warp into vast, self-sustaining intelligences over the course of millions of years. Khorne coalesced from the collective rage and bloodlust of every sentient being that ever killed or was killed. Tzeentch formed from the hopes, ambitions, and scheming of every consciousness that ever desired change. Nurgle was born from the fear of death and the acceptance of decay, and Slaanesh, the youngest of the four, was birthed in a single catastrophic moment when the psychic excesses of the ancient Eldari civilization reached a critical mass and tore open the Eye of Terror. If those emotions could create gods, then why not faith? Why not devotion? Why not the collective belief of trillions upon trillions of human beings who pray to the Emperor every single day, who offer their lives in his service, who die believing with absolute certainty that their God is watching over them? The sheer weight of psychic energy generated by the Imperial Creed is almost incalculable. It spans 1,000,000 worlds and touches billions of minds. If that energy is coalescing around the fragment of the Emperor's soul that he cast into the warp, then the being that will eventually emerge from that process might be the most powerful entity the galaxy has ever known. But there is a terrifying counterpoint to this optimistic vision. A god born from the warp is shaped by the beliefs and emotions that created it, and the beliefs of the Imperium are not characterized by mercy and compassion. The Imperial Creed teaches that the Emperor is a wrathful deity who demands absolute obedience and punishes heresy with annihilation. The faith of the Imperium is soaked in blood and fire, in purges and pogroms, in the burning of witches, and the destruction of worlds deemed too corrupt to save. If a god were born from that faith, it might be righteous, but it would also be terrible. A god of war and judgment, of purging fire and uncompromising authority. A being that protects humanity the way a wildfire protects a forest, by burning away everything that does not serve its purpose. The connection to the sensei is worth mentioning here as well, even though this aspect of the lore has been largely superseded by newer narratives. The sensei were said to be the Emperor's biological children, immortal beings sired during his millennia of walking among humanity. They possessed a unique relationship with the warp that made them invisible to psychic senses, even to the Emperor himself. A secret organization called the Illuminati, composed of humans who had survived demonic possession and gained a special resistance to chaos, worked toward a plan to sacrifice the sensei to the Star Child at the critical moment, providing the surge of power needed for the Emperor's soul to complete its rebirth. While the sensei and Illuminati have been largely written out of the main narrative, replaced by the concept of perpetuals, the core idea behind them persists in the current lore. The notion that the Emperor's rebirth requires sacrifice, that the Star Child needs fuel to achieve critical mass, that someone must pay the price for humanity's salvation remains a recurring theme. In many ways, the daily sacrifice of psykers to the Golden Throne can be seen as a slow-motion version of the Illuminati's plan, each soul consumed by the Emperor, contributing a tiny fraction of psychic energy to the growing entity in the warp. The grand irony of the Emperor's existence is impossible to ignore here. He spent his entire life fighting against the very concept of divinity. He rejected worship, punished those who called him a god, and dedicated himself to the imperial truth, the doctrine that there were no gods, no spirits, no supernatural powers, only the natural universe and humanity's ability to master it. And now, through the faith of the very species he sought to enlighten, he is becoming exactly what he denied being, a god. Yes, and this brings us to the Terminus Decree. Deep within the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights, on the moon of Titan, in a chamber so heavily warded against psychic intrusion that even the most powerful psykers in the galaxy cannot penetrate its defenses, locked away in a vault said to hold the tomb of Malkador the Sigillite himself, there rests a simple wooden box. It is a remarkably modest container for a secret of such magnitude, unadorned except for a single golden seal that catches the light with an almost living warmth. That seal is said to be the exact match of another seal found in only one place in the entire Imperium, upon the Emperor's golden throne. Within this box is an ancient parchment, its surface yellowed by the passage of millennia, its ink faded but still legible, containing instructions known as the Terminus Decree. Only the Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights knows how to open the box, and he is instructed to do so only when all hope for the future of humanity seems lost. The box has been passed from Supreme Grand Master to Supreme Grand Master for 10,000 years, each one adding their own seal of protection, each one hoping that they will never be the one forced to open it. For centuries, the Terminus Decree was one of the most tantalizing mysteries in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. No one knew what it said. No one knew what it commanded. Theories ranged from instructions to activate the Talisman of 7 Hammers and destroy Terra, to a ritual that would sacrifice the entire Grey Knights chapter to reignite the Emperor's power. Due to the formation of the Great Rift, the massive warp storm that has torn the galaxy in two, us Khaldor Drago and the other Grey Knights Grandmasters have supposedly begun considering whether the time has come to read the Terminus Decree. The galaxy is in the worst state it has been in since the Horus Heresy. Entire sectors have been cut off from the light of the Astronomicon. Worlds that have been loyal to the Imperium for millennia are falling to chaos, to alien invasion, to simple starvation as trade routes collapse and supply lines are severed. The Great Rift has created a permanent wound in reality that stretches across the entire galaxy, and through that wound, the energies of the warp pour into the material universe in quantities not seen since the fall of the Eldari. If there was ever a moment when all hope for the future of humanity seemed lost, this might be it. And then, with the release of the 10th edition Grey Knights Codex, the mystery was finally resolved, and the answer was both surprising and deeply unsettling. The Terminus Decree states, in clear and unambiguous terms, that the Emperor of mankind can never be allowed to leave the Golden Throne, not through being returned to life, not through being reborn in another's body, not through ascending as some kind of warp entity. If any of these things should somehow occur, the Grey Knights must return the Emperor to his terrible duty, no matter what forces seek to oppose them. Let that sink in for a moment. The Emperor himself, the most powerful being in the galaxy, the god figure of trillions, wrote instructions commanding his most loyal warriors to stop him from being free. If the Emperor should somehow rise from the throne, whether through healing, a reincarnation, or divine ascension, the Grey Knights are ordered to put him back. The implications are staggering. The Emperor apparently foresaw the possibility of his own resurrection or ascension, and decided that it must not be allowed to happen. He apparently understood that his continued presence on the Golden Throne is more important than his own freedom, more important than his own suffering, more important than any possible future in which he walks among humanity once again. Why? What does the Emperor know that no one else does? One interpretation, drawing from the events of the end and the death, is that the Emperor is terrified of what he might become if he is freed from the throne. During his battle with Horus, he was on the verge of ascending to godhood, of becoming a warp entity so powerful that it could have challenged the Chaos Gods directly. He chose not to, recognizing that such a transformation would make him something fundamentally inhuman, something that might protect humanity but would no longer be able to love it. If the Emperor were to die and be reborn as a god, or if he were to heal and rise from the throne with the accumulated psychic power of 10,000 years of worship, the result might be something similar. A being of immense power but no compassion. A god that protects humanity the way a farmer protects his livestock, not out of love but out of utility. An entity that has shed the last remnants of the man it once was and become a cosmic force as alien and uncaring as the Chaos Gods themselves. As the Terminus Decree suggests that the Emperor believes it is better to suffer eternally on the throne than to risk becoming that kind of god. Better to endure 10,000 years of unceasing agony. Better to consume the souls of billions of psychers. Better to hold the galaxy together through sheer force of will while his body slowly rots around him, than to be free and lose what little remains of his humanity. It is, perhaps, the most heroic and most tragic act of self-sacrifice in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. But the decree also raises a terrifying question. If the Grey Knights are ordered to return the Emperor to the throne, that implies they would have to fight their way through the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000 golden warriors who have guarded the Emperor for 10 millennia and would die to the last man to protect him. It implies they would have to overcome whatever forces might be aligned with a reborn Emperor, including potentially other Space Marine chapters, the Ecclesiarchy, and the trillions of faithful humans who would see the Emperor's return as the fulfillment of their deepest prayers. The Terminus Decree is not just a set of instructions. It is the blueprint for a second civil war, a war that would make the Horus heresy look like a minor disagreement. Consider the sheer logistics of what the Grey Knights would be asked to do. The chapter numbers approximately 1,000 battle brothers, each one a powerful psyker and a warrior of extraordinary skill. They are among the finest fighters in the Imperium, trained specifically to combat demonic threats and wield powers that ordinary Space Marines cannot access. But their numbers are tiny compared to the forces that would stand between them and the Golden Throne. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, number approximately 10,000 warriors. Each custodian is individually more powerful than a Space Marine, equipped with the finest war gear in the Imperium and possessing reflexes, strength, and tactical awareness that make even veteran Astartes look clumsy by comparison. They have guarded the Emperor for 10,000 years with a devotion that borders on the absolute. If the Emperor rose from the throne and they saw him walking and speaking and acting for the first time in 100 centuries, they would not willingly allow anyone to force him back. They would fight to the last man to defend their returned lord. Then there are the Sisters of Silence, the psychic nulls who serve alongside the Custodes. The Reformed Sisterhood would be a formidable obstacle for any psyker force, and the Grey Knights, whose combat abilities are deeply intertwined with their psychic powers, would find themselves significantly weakened in the presence of these blank-souled warriors. Beyond the physical defenders of the throne, consider the political fallout. If the Emperor returned, and the Grey Knights attempted to force him back onto the throne, they would be acting against the wishes of every living human in the galaxy. The ecclesiarchy would declare them heretics. The Astra Militarum would mobilize against them. Other Space Marine chapters would come to the Emperor's defense. The Grey Knights would be fighting not just the Custodes, but potentially the entire Imperium. And yet, the decree commands it. Yet the Emperor himself, the being whose word is law to every citizen of the Imperium, wrote these instructions knowing full well what they would require. He looked into the future, saw the possibility of his own return, and decided that the cost of freedom was too high, not for himself, but for the species he was created to protect. There is a theory, whispered in the darkest corners of the Inquisition, that the Terminus Decree is not meant to be carried out successfully, that it is, in fact, a test. The Emperor, knowing that his Grey Knights are among the most loyal and incorruptible warriors in the galaxy, gave them an impossible order as a final safeguard. If they attempt to carry it out and the Emperor stops them, then he is still himself, still the being who cares enough about his species to fight for his own freedom. But if they attempt it, and he does not resist, if the Emperor allows himself to be returned to the throne without protest, then something has gone terribly wrong. The Emperor who rose from the throne is no longer the Emperor, and the galaxy is in even greater danger than it was before. Whatever the truth of the Terminus Decree, its existence tells us something profound about the Emperor's character. Even after 10,000 years of suffering, even after becoming something that his own son described as cold and inhuman, the Emperor is still capable of sacrifice. He is still capable of putting the needs of humanity above his own desire for freedom. He is still, in some fundamental sense, the being who was created by the shamans of ancient terror to protect the species from the darkness that lurks in the warp, and that, well, perhaps more than any miracle or manifestation or psychic phenomenon, is the strongest evidence that the Emperor is still in there, that somewhere beneath the golden machinery and the stasis fields and the endless agony, the man who dreamed of a united humanity still exists. So what would the galaxy actually look like if the Emperor woke up? Not in the Star Child scenario, not through death and rebirth, but in the most dramatic and commonly imagined version of this thought experiment. The Emperor's body heals, his eyes open, and the master of mankind rises from the golden throne for the first time in 10,000 years. The first thing that would happen is the most immediately practical and the most immediately dangerous, the webway breach. If the Emperor has been holding this breach closed with his psychic might for 10 millennia, then his departure from the throne would potentially reopen it. Demons would pour into the heart of the imperial palace, flooding terror with creatures of nightmare. Unless the breach has been slowly healing, as some theories suggest, or unless the Emperor can seal it permanently as he rises, the very act of standing up would trigger an invasion of the Imperium's capital world. Assuming the breach can be dealt with, the next consideration is the Astronomicon. If the Emperor leaves the throne, who directs the psychic beacon? The 10,000 psychers in the chamber of the Astronomicon provide the energy, but only the Emperor has the mental capacity to focus and direct it across 50,000 light-years of space. Without him, the beacon would become an unfocused blast of psychic energy, useless for navigation and potentially dangerous to those exposed to it. Imperial shipping would grind to a halt. Worlds would be isolated. The Imperium would begin to fragment. Unless, again, the Emperor has a plan. Unless he has spent 10,000 years preparing for this moment, working out in the vast computational engine of his mind how to transition the Astronomicon to a different power source, or how to create a replacement that does not require his constant attention. The Emperor was, after all, the greatest scientist and engineer in human history. If anyone could solve this problem, he could. But let us set aside the practical considerations and look at the political implications, because those are where things get truly interesting. The Emperor who walked among humanity during the Great Crusade was a staunch atheist, yet he rejected the concept of gods, forbade religious worship, and built his Imperium on the foundation of the imperial truth, the doctrine that the universe was a rational, comprehensible place, governed by natural laws, and that superstition and faith were weaknesses to be overcome. He quite literally went to war against religious belief, destroying churches and temples on conquered worlds, and re-educating populations that clung to spiritual traditions. The Imperium he would wake up to is the exact opposite of everything he stood for. The ecclesiarchy, the state religion of the Imperium, worships the emperor as a literal god. The imperial creed teaches that the emperor is the divine father of humanity, that prayer to him provides protection against the forces of chaos, and that heresy against the imperial faith is the gravest of all sins. The entire social, political, and military structure of the Imperium is built on a foundation of religious devotion that the emperor himself would find repugnant. Imagine the scene. The emperor rises from the golden throne, his body healed, his mind clear, his power restored. He walks through the corridors of the imperial palace, past the cathedrals and shrines that have been built in his name over the past 10 millennia. He sees the golden statues depicting him as a divine being, the stained glass windows telling stories of his miracles, the billion candles lit by the faithful in their devotion to the God Emperor of mankind. And he remembers that he told humanity, in no uncertain terms, that he was not a god. The irony would be almost unbearable. But it gets worse, because the emperor's first instinct might be to tear it all down, to dismantle the ecclesiarchy, to abolish the imperial creed, to return to the rational secular imperium he originally created. And doing so would be the single most destructive thing he could possibly do. He tried this once before, in fact. During the Great Crusade, when the Primarch Lorga of the Word-Bearers insisted on worshipping the emperor as a god, the master of mankind responded with devastating force. He sent the Ultramarines to raze the city of Monarchia, the most beautiful temple city that Lorgar had built in the emperor's honor, reducing it to ashes, while forcing Lorgar and his entire legion to kneel in the rubble and be told, in the most humiliating way possible, that they were wrong. The emperor was not a god. He would not be worshipped. The imperial truth was the only truth. That act of humiliation drove Lorgar into the arms of chaos. The Primarch, desperate for something to believe in, sought out the dark gods of the warp and found in them the divinity that his father had denied him. The Word-Bearers became the first legion to fall to corruption, and their betrayal was the spark that lit the fire of the Horus heresy. In a very real sense, the emperor's refusal to accept worship was one of the root causes of the very catastrophe that put him on the golden throne. Now imagine him trying the same thing again, but on a galactic scale. 10,000 years of religious infrastructure, millions of churches and cathedrals, billions of priests and missionaries, an entire civilization built on the bedrock of faith in the God Emperor, all of it threatened by the very being it was built to honor. Yet the ecclesiarchy would not go quietly. The faithful would not abandon their beliefs just because the object of their worship told them to. History shows us that religious institutions are among the most resilient structures human civilization produces, capable of surviving persecution, suppression, and even the apparent disproving of their foundational claims. The imperial creed would survive the emperor's denial of his own divinity, and it would do so by declaring the emperor a heretic against himself, a concept so paradoxical that only a truly medieval religious bureaucracy could produce it. Because in the current era, faith works. The worship of the emperor generates genuine psychic power in the warp, power that manifests as miracles on the battlefield that empowers living saints. Or that gives the faithful a real and measurable advantage in their fights against the forces of chaos. The Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, channel their faith into acts of war that border on the supernatural. The devotion of billions provides a bulwark against the whispers of the dark gods. To remove that faith, to tell the Imperium that their god was never a god, would be to strip away the single most effective weapon that humanity possesses against its greatest enemy. The Emperor would face a choice that would define the future of the human species. Accept the mantle of godhood, becoming the thing he always said he was not, and use the power of human faith to wage war against the chaos gods on equal terms. Or reject divinity, hold to the principles he established 10,000 years ago, and watch as the Imperium tears itself apart in a crisis of faith that would make the Horus heresy look like a minor squabble. Guilliman has already wrestled with this dilemma in miniature. As Imperial Regent, the Primarch has had to navigate between his father's original vision and the reality of the Imperium as it exists today. He allows the ecclesiarchy to function because he recognizes that faith serves a practical purpose, even though he personally finds the worship of his father uncomfortable and philosophically troubling. A returning emperor would face this same dilemma on a vastly larger scale, with the added complication that he himself is the object of the worship he despises. Then there is the question of the Space Marines. The Emperor created the original 20 legions of the Astartes, but after the Horus heresy, Guilliman broke the legions down into smaller units called chapters, each limited to approximately 1,000 warriors. This was done explicitly to prevent any single commander from ever again wielding enough military power to threaten the Imperium itself, as Horus had done. The Emperor might want to reverse this decision and reconstitute the legions, creating the massive armies of superhuman warriors that he originally envisioned. But doing so would terrify the existing power structures of the Imperium, who have spent 10 millennia ensuring that no one entity possesses too much military authority. And then there are the Primarchs. Several of the Emperor's loyal sons are still alive, or at least unaccounted for. Rogel Dawn may have died during the First Black Crusade, but his body was never recovered. The Lion, Primarch of the Dark Angels, has recently returned in the lore. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves, disappeared into the warp, promising to return in humanity's darkest hour. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars vanished into the webway. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard was last seen in the warp, transformed into something that hunts demons. Vulcan, the Perpetual, simply vanished after the heresy, promising to return when he was needed. If the Emperor woke up, would these Primarchs sense it? Would they return, drawn by the psychic call of their father, assembling once more as they did during the Great Crusade? The prospect is both exhilarating and deeply troubling. The Primarchs were never a harmonious brotherhood, even at the best of times. Yet the rivalries and resentments that contributed to the Horus heresy were not solely the product of chaos manipulation. They were also the result of genuine personality conflicts between beings who were too powerful and too proud to easily cooperate. A returned emperor would also have to deal with the Inquisition, a sprawling and fractious organization that has spent 10,000 years acting as the emperor's will made manifest, enforcing orthodoxy and hunting heretics across the galaxy. The Inquisition operates with virtually unlimited authority, answering to no one except, in theory, the emperor himself. Many inquisitors would welcome the emperor's return. Others, particularly those whose power depends on the emperor's absence and silence, might resist it. The various ordos of the Inquisition, the Ordo Malleus, demon hunters, as the Ordo Hereticus, witch hunters, and the Ordo Xenos, alien hunters, would each have their own agendas and their own concerns about an active emperor disrupting their operations. And then there are the enemies. The Chaos Gods would not sit idle while the emperor regained his strength. The great battle cry of the green-skinned hordes would echo across every contested world as they sought to take advantage of the upheaval. The Tyranids, those endless swarms of bioengineered predators, would continue their relentless advance into the galaxy, drawn by the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon. Indeed, if the Emperor's psychic presence grew stronger, it might draw the hive fleets even faster. The Necrons, the ancient metallic warriors who seek to reclaim the galaxy they once ruled, would observe the Emperor's return with cold, calculating interest, considering how this new variable affected their own long-term plans. The galaxy would not simply cheer and welcome the Emperor back. every faction, every power, every entity with an interest in the fate of the galaxy would react, and their reactions would be as varied and as unpredictable as the beings themselves. Consider the Adeptus Mechanicus, the technology-worshipping organization that has maintained the Golden Throne for 10 millennia. The Mechanicus worships the Emperor as the Omnissiah, the machine god incarnate, the divine embodiment of technological perfection. Their entire theology is built around the idea that the Emperor is the supreme expression of the union between flesh and machine. A living Emperor who could speak for himself, who could clarify his relationship to technology and the machine god, which would either validate or destroy the foundational beliefs of one of the most powerful organizations in the Imperium. If the Emperor confirmed that he was the Omnissiah, the Mechanicus would be ecstatic. They would bring the full weight of their immense industrial capacity to bear in service of the returned God Emperor, producing weapons and ships and technology at a rate that would transform the Imperium's military capabilities overnight. But if the Emperor denied being the machine god, if he told the tech priests that their religion was as false as the Imperial Creed, the Mechanicus might fracture. Civil war within the Mechanicus would be devastating, cutting off the Imperium's supply of advanced technology at the worst possible time. Then consider the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, yet the vast mortal army that forms the backbone of the Imperium's military might. These are ordinary human beings, men and women recruited or conscripted from a million worlds, who fight and die by the billions in the Emperor's name. For these soldiers, the Emperor is more than a distant deity. He is the reason they fight, the source of their courage, the light that keeps the darkness at bay. Many guardsmen carry small icons of the Emperor into battle, whisper his litanies before charging enemy positions, and die with his name on their lips. The return of a living Emperor would galvanize the Imperial Guard in a way that nothing else could. The morale boost alone would be incalculable. Soldiers who had been fighting, losing battles for decades, would find new reserves of courage and determination. Worlds that had been on the verge of falling to the enemy would rally. The great war machine of the Imperium, which has been grinding forward on inertia and desperation for millennia, would suddenly have a purpose and a direction that it has not possessed since the Great Crusade. But consider also the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, the militant arm of the ecclesiarchy. These warrior women are among the most fanatically devoted servants of the Emperor in the entire Imperium. They have fought and died for the God Emperor with a fervor that makes even space marines pause. Their faith is not abstract or philosophical. It is personal, visceral, all-consuming. A living Emperor who confirmed their faith would make them the most dangerous fighting force in the galaxy, empowered by a devotion that now had a living, breathing focus. But a living Emperor who rejected their worship would shatter them. The Sisters of Battle without their faith would be like a sword without a blade. And what about the forces of chaos? The Chaos Gods have spent 10,000 years operating under the assumption that the Emperor is trapped, weakened, unable to act directly against them. Their plans, their schemes, their grand designs for the corruption and consumption of humanity have all been built on this assumption. A fully awakened Emperor would overturn every calculation, invalidate every strategy, and force the Chaos Gods to confront an adversary who has been growing stronger with every prayer whispered in his name for 100 centuries. The demon Primarchs, in particular, would have reason to fear. Mortarion already experienced the Emperor's wrath during the events of Godblight, and the experience left him diminished and humiliated. Magnus the Red, who bears a particular share of responsibility for the Emperor's imprisonment on the throne, would face a reckoning that has been 10,000 years in the making. Fulgrim, Perturabo, Lorgar, Angron, each of them would know that a fully empowered Emperor would be coming for them, and that this time there would be no mercy. But the Chaos Gods themselves are not easily overcome. They are fundamental forces of the warp, embodiments of emotions and concepts that have existed for as long as sentient life has been generating psychic energy. They cannot be killed in any conventional sense, only weakened, and they have proven remarkably resilient, even in the face of direct opposition. The Emperor might be able to push them back, to limit their influence, or to protect humanity from the worst of their predations. But destroying them entirely, that might be beyond even his power, especially given that the very act of waging war against them would feed their strength. War feeds Horn. Strategy feeds Tzeentch. The suffering of billions feeds Nurgle. And the desire for victory, for glory, for the pleasure of triumph, feeds Slaanesh. The green-skinned hordes present a different kind of problem entirely. The great warlike aliens do not worship the Emperor, do not fear him in the way that the servants of Chaos do, and would not be deterred by his return in the slightest. If anything, the appearance of a being of such immense power would excite them beyond measure. The greatest fighters among them would race to challenge the Emperor in personal combat, as viewing such a battle as the ultimate test of strength and skill. A galactic crusade against the alien hordes would be a war of attrition on a scale that even a returned Emperor might find daunting. The Tyranids, those vast swarms of bioengineered predators from beyond the galaxy, represent perhaps the most existential threat of all. These creatures are drawn to the galaxy by the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon, following its light like moths to a flame. A fully empowered Emperor, projecting psychic energy on an even greater scale than the current Astronomicon, might draw the hive fleets even faster, accelerating an invasion that already threatens to consume every living thing in the Milky Way. And then there are the Necrons, the ancient metallic warriors who slumber beneath the surfaces of thousands of worlds, is slowly awakening from their 60 million year sleep. The Necrons predate the Imperium, predate humanity itself, and their technology is so far advanced beyond anything the Imperium possesses that it makes the Golden Throne look like a child's toy. The Necrons have their own plans for the galaxy, plans that involve the construction of vast networks of pylons designed to seal the material universe off from the warp entirely. A returned Emperor, who is himself a being of immense psychic power and therefore intimately connected to the warp, would be both a potential ally and a potential obstacle to these plans. The political implications within the Imperium itself would be equally complex. The High Lords of Terror, the oligarchic ruling council that has governed the Imperium in the Emperor's name for 10 millennia, would face an existential crisis. Their authority derives entirely from the Emperor's absence. They rule because he cannot. If he returns, their positions become redundant overnight. Some would welcome this, relieved to hand over the burden of governance to the being who was always meant to bear it. Others, those who have grown accustomed to the power and privilege that comes with ruling a galaxy-spanning empire, might resist. History teaches us that those who hold power rarely relinquish it willingly, even when commanded to do so by the very authority they claim to represent. But perhaps the most important question is not what the galaxy would do, but what the Emperor himself would do. Because the being who might rise from the Golden Throne would not be the same being who was placed upon it 10,000 years ago. What he would carry within him the accumulated weight of 100 centuries of suffering, of holding the galaxy together through sheer force of will, while his body rotted and his mind was assaulted by the most powerful malevolent entities in existence. He would have spent 10,000 years consuming the souls of psychers, fighting an endless war in the warp, maintaining a psychic beacon of unimaginable power, and holding closed a breach in reality that threatens to devour the planet he once called home. What does that kind of experience do to a mind, even one as vast and powerful as the Emperor's? Guilliman believed that his father had become cold, inhuman, that the warmth and compassion that had once been part of the Emperor's character had been stripped away by the millennia of torment, leaving something that was more machine than man, was more force of nature than individual. If Guilliman is right, then the Emperor who wakes up might not be a savior in any sense that humanity would recognize. He might be a being of pure purpose, a consciousness so focused on the survival of the species that individual humans are nothing more than data points in a calculation too vast for mortal comprehension. He might look at the Imperium and see not a civilization to be reformed, but a machine to be optimized. He might view the trillions of humans who worship him not as beloved children, but as resources to be allocated. He might make decisions that are strategically optimal, but morally horrifying, sacrificing worlds and populations with the same cold efficiency that a general sacrifices pawns on a chessboard. Or he might surprise everyone, because there is another possibility, while one suggested by the fragment of his soul that he cast into the warp during his battle with Horus, the fragment that contained his hope and his compassion. If that fragment has been growing, fed by the faith of billions, then perhaps it has been working its way back toward the Emperor's consciousness, slowly reintegrating the humanity that he sacrificed to defeat his son. Perhaps the cold alien being that Gilliman encountered on the throne is not the final form of the Emperor, but a transitional state, a caterpillar that has not yet completed its transformation. Perhaps, when the Emperor finally opens his eyes, what looks back at the galaxy will be something that combines the cold strategic genius of the being who held the Imperium together for 10 millennia with the warmth and compassion of the man who wept over the bodies of fallen warriors during the Unification Wars. A being that is neither fully human nor fully divine, but something new, something that the galaxy has never seen before. The Emperor's first words, whatever they might be, would echo across the galaxy like a thunderclap. Every psyker in the Imperium would feel them. Every astropath, every navigator, every sanctioned psyker bound to the Emperor's service would experience the moment as a psychic event of unprecedented magnitude. The Astronomicon would flare with a brilliance that would make it visible not just to navigators but to ordinary humans, and a golden light in the heavens that would be seen on every world within its range. The Chaos Gods would feel it too. In the depths of the warp, in their twisted realms of blood and plague and scheming and excess, the four great powers of chaos would experience something they have not felt since the Emperor first stepped onto the galactic stage 30,000 years ago. The presence of the anathema, unbound and unrestrained, radiating power that burns them like sunlight burns shadow. Their demons would howl, their champions would tremble, and in the eternal game of power and manipulation that the Chaos Gods play against one another and against the material universe, a new piece would appear on the board, a piece so powerful that it changes the rules of the game entirely. On a million worlds, the faithful would fall to their knees. They have prayed for this moment for 100 centuries, lighting candles in dark cathedrals, whispering litanies in trenches filled with mud and blood, clinging to their faith like a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood in a storm-tossed sea. And now, at last, their prayers would be answered. The God Emperor of mankind, the light in the darkness, the shield against the night, would speak. What would he say? Would he forgive his species for the mess they have made of his dream? Would he condemn them for turning his rational, secular Imperium into a theocratic nightmare of superstition and suffering? Would he weep at the sight of a galaxy that has spent 10,000 years tearing itself apart in his name? Would he rage at the injustice of his imprisonment, at the agony he has endured, as at the billions of souls consumed to keep him alive? Or would he simply look out at the Imperium he created, at the flawed, broken, monstrous, beautiful thing that humanity has become in his absence, and do what he has always done? Get to work. There is a passage in the lore that seems to hint at this possibility. During the Psychic Awakening event, visions of a golden infant interspersed with flashes of a radiant being rising from a throne of light began to be reported across astropathic relay networks throughout the Imperium. Over time, the images became clearer, and many began to interpret them as connected to the legend of the Star Child. A golden child rising from a throne, the old becoming new, death becoming life, the Emperor waking up. There is a moment in every great story where the future hangs in the balance, where all the threads of plot and character converge on a single point of infinite possibility. For the Warhammer 40,000 universe, that moment is approaching. It may take years of real-world publishing to get there, or it may happen in a sudden, dramatic reveal that changes everything we think we know about the setting. But the signs are unmistakable. The Emperor is stirring. The being on the golden throne, the Carrion Lord, the master of mankind, the anathema of chaos, is not merely surviving, he is changing, growing, becoming. And when the transformation is complete, when the chrysalis finally cracks and the golden light spills out into a galaxy that has been drowning in darkness for 10,000 years, nothing will ever be the same. Will he be the savior that humanity has prayed for? Will he be the monster that Gilliman fears? Will he be the god that the ecclesiarchy worships, or the man who rejected divinity so completely that even 10 millennia of godlike worship could not change his fundamental nature? Will the Grey Knights be forced to enact the terminus decree, dragging their own creator back to his prison for the good of the species? Will the talisman of 7 hammers activate, consuming terror in fire and ending the story before it can begin? No one knows. Not the High Lords of Terror, not the Chaos Gods, not the ancient Eldari, with their millennia of foresight and prophecy, perhaps not even the Emperor himself. But somewhere beneath the mountains of terror, in a chamber so vast that it could hold armies and so silent that the only sound is the endless hum of machinery that no one alive truly understands, something is happening. The stasis fields flicker. The psi fusion generators pulse with a rhythm that has been slowly, almost imperceptibly changing. The psychic output of the Golden Throne has been increasing year by year, century by century, like the heartbeat of a being waking from a very long sleep. The Custodes have noticed. The tech priests have noticed. The chaos gods have noticed. And in the darkest corners of the warp, where even demons fear to tread, something ancient and vast is opening its eyes. The Emperor is waking up, and the galaxy will tremble when he does. There is one more thing worth considering as we draw this discussion to a close. One final piece of the puzzle that puts everything else into context. Throughout the 10,000 years of his imprisonment, the Emperor has not been idle. His mind, we are told, has been active in the warp, of fighting battles and making plans that no one in the material universe is fully aware of. He soul-binds psychers, marking them with a fragment of his power that protects them from the worst predations of the warp. He communicates through the Emperor's tarot, providing cryptic guidance to those with the psychic sensitivity to interpret his signals. He holds audiences, of a sort, with his most important servants, conveying his will through dreams, visions, and the occasional, brutal psychic communication that leaves the recipient reeling. He has, in short, never stopped ruling the Imperium. He has simply been doing it from behind a veil of machinery and silence, using tools so subtle that most of his subjects do not even realize they are being guided. The Imperium thinks of the Emperor as a passive figure, a body on a throne, as a battery powering a lighthouse. But the evidence suggests that he is anything but passive. Every miracle, every saint, every answered prayer, every intervention that turned the tide of a battle at the crucial moment, these are not accidents. They are decisions, made by a mind that has been watching, calculating, and acting for 10,000 years. When that mind finally wakes up, when it sheds the constraints of the Golden Throne and enters the material universe as an active, visible presence, the sheer weight of 10 millennia of accumulated wisdom, planning, and preparation will be brought to bear on the galaxy's problems. The Emperor will not be a confused ruler waking from a coma, disoriented and out of touch with the state of his empire. He will be a being who has been silently directing the fate of 1,000,000 worlds for 100 centuries, finally able to act openly rather than through intermediaries and subtle influences. That is what makes the prospect of the Emperor's awakening so compelling and so terrifying. It is not just the return of a powerful warrior or a brilliant leader. It is the unveiling of a plan that has been in motion for 10,000 years, crafted by the most intelligent mind in human history, using resources and strategies that no one else in the galaxy even knows exist. What is the Emperor planning? What has he been doing all this time? What moves has he been making on a chessboard so vast that the pieces are entire civilizations and the stakes are the survival of a species? We do not know, but when he wakes up, we will find out. And the answer will change everything. The lore continues to evolve, and Games Workshop has been slowly, carefully moving the narrative toward a confrontation that has been building for 40 years of real-world publishing. The return of Guilliman, the opening of the Great Rift, the Psychic Awakening, the Indomitus Crusade, the revelation of the Terminus Decree. These are not isolated events. They are chapters in a story that is heading somewhere specific. And that somewhere is the Golden Throne, and the being who sits upon it, and the moment when 10,000 years of silence finally come to an end. Whether that end takes the form of a glorious resurrection, a terrifying ascension, or something altogether stranger and more wonderful than any of us can imagine, one thing is certain. The Emperor of mankind, the anathema of chaos, but the master of humanity, the being who sacrificed everything he was and everything he could have been for the sake of a species that worships him as a god while following almost none of his teachings, is not done yet. He is still fighting, still enduring, still dreaming of a future where humanity is free from the darkness that has haunted it since the first human looked up at the stars and felt afraid of what might be looking back. Still holding on, with a grip forged from suffering and tempered by a love for his species that 10,000 years of agony have not been able to extinguish. And one day, he will open his eyes, and when he does, the galaxy will hold its breath. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there is also something else. Something that burns in the depths of the Golden Throne like a candle in an endless night, fragile and stubborn, and refusing to go out, no matter how fiercely the darkness presses in. Hope. The Emperor is waking up, and hope is waking with him. That is where we will leave things for today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating questions in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us continue bringing you these explorations of the grim darkness of the far future. Until next time, may the Emperor protect, and may you be ready for the day when he decides to do it in person.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.